The air in Delivery Room 3 was a familiar symphony to Dr. Alistair Wells. It was a blend of hushed, urgent whispers, the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, and the strained, powerful breaths of a mother bringing a new life into the world. For 30 years, Alistair had stood in rooms just like this one. He was a master conductor of this controlled chaos, a respected figure of calm authority. His silver hair was perfectly in place, his blue scrubs immaculate. His face, etched with the lines of 1,000 sleepless nights and 1,000 successful deliveries, was a mask of professional composure. Tonight was no different, or so it seemed. The final push was a triumph of human will. A new cry, small but fierce, sliced through the tension in the room. "It is a boy," Alistair announced, his voice even and calm, as it always was. He skillfully clamped and cut the umbilical cord, his movements precise and economical. There was a quiet efficiency to him that junior doctors admired and nurses found intimidating. He was not a man for small talk or warm reassurances. He was a man of science and results. The nurses quickly cleaned the newborn and wrapped him in a soft white blanket. They placed the baby on his mother's chest. Her name was Elena. Her face was slick with sweat, her hair matted to her forehead, but her eyes shone with a brilliant, tear-filled light. She was beautiful in her exhaustion and joy. She cooed at her son, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of his cheek. Alistair watched for a moment, a standard post-delivery observation. He was about to turn away, to make his notes and leave the new family to their first precious moments. But then, it happened. The baby, nestled against his mother, stirred. A tiny, perfect hand, with fingers as fragile as spun glass, emerged from the blanket. It waved uncertainly in the air for a second before reaching out, reaching for him. Before Alistair could react, the baby's minuscule fingers found his. They curled around the tip of his index finger, a surprisingly strong grip for someone so new. It was a common, reflexive action, something he had experienced countless times. But this time, it was different. The moment the baby's skin touched his, a jolt, electric and fierce, shot up Alistair's arm. The steady beeping of the monitor seemed to warp and fade. The sterile white walls of the delivery room dissolved into a dizzying blur. For a split second, he was no longer in this room. He was somewhere else, another hospital, decades ago. The light was dimmer, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear. He heard a different sound, not a cry of life, but a frantic, desperate beep of a machine failing. He saw a younger version of himself, his face pale with panic, his hands shaking. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. He was back in Delivery Room 3. The baby was still holding his finger. Alistair snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. A gasp escaped his lips, loud in the relative quiet of the room. "Dr. Wells, are you all right?" a young nurse asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Alistair stared at his own hand, now trembling slightly. He could not speak. He felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. The mask of composure had not just slipped, it had shattered. Without a word, he turned and walked stiffly out of the room, leaving behind a confused medical team and a new mother too lost in the miracle of her child to notice the doctor's sudden crisis. In the hallway, Alistair leaned against the cool wall, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was just a baby, a simple, innocent newborn. So why did it feel like that tiny hand had reached directly into his chest and squeezed a secret he had buried for 30 years? What had that child just exposed? Dr. Alistair Wells lived a life of deliberate, meticulous order. His house was a testament to this. It was a modern, minimalist structure of glass and steel overlooking the city lights. Inside, there was no clutter. Not a single photograph sat on the polished surfaces. Not a book was out of place on the built-in shelves. The colors were muted grays, whites, and blacks. It was less of a home and more of a gallery, quiet and empty, mirroring the man who lived within its walls. His evenings were predictable. He would return from the hospital, prepare a simple, healthy meal he ate alone, and then read medical journals until it was time to sleep. It was a solitary existence, one he had carefully constructed to keep the world and its messy emotions at a safe distance. At the hospital, he was a giant. As the chief of obstetrics, his word was law. He moved through the halls with an air of untouchable authority. Junior doctors scrambled to prepare for his rounds, knowing he would quiz them mercilessly, his sharp eyes missing no detail. He demanded perfection because, in his line of work, anything less could have dire consequences. He was respected for his skill, for the lives he had saved, for the department he ran with unmatched efficiency. But he was not loved. No one ever asked about his weekend. No one shared a casual joke with him by the coffee machine. He was Dr. Wells, a brilliant mind in a pristine white coat, and that was all he allowed anyone to see. There were those who resented his cold reign. Dr. Mark Roberts was chief among them. Roberts was younger, with an easy smile and a charm that made patients feel comfortable and colleagues feel included. He saw Alistair not as a legend, but as a relic. "Another perfect day, Alistair," Roberts would say, his tone light, but his eyes holding a competitive glint. "It must be wonderful to be so certain all the time, to have never taken a wrong step." Alistair would simply offer a curt nod and walk away, refusing to engage. He knew Roberts was ambitious. He knew the man was watching him, waiting for any sign of weakness. But beneath the polished armor, a deep weariness had settled into Alistair's soul. There were quiet moments late at night in his sterile office when the mask would fall. He would stand by the large window, looking down at the sprawling city, a universe of lives unfolding below him. In the reflection on the glass, he would see not a powerful chief of medicine, but a lonely man haunted by a past he refused to acknowledge. A profound sadness would cloud his features, a vulnerability so deep that he barely recognized himself. Then he would take a slow breath, straighten his shoulders, and the formidable Dr. Wells would be back in place. He channeled all his energy, all his pain, into his work. It was his penance and his sanctuary. His dedication was absolute, a silent promise to never let what happened once happen again. This was the world he had built, a world of control, of solitude, of secrets, and it was this world that was now threatening to collapse, all because of the touch of a tiny hand. Standing in the quiet, sterile hallway, Alistair struggled to breathe. The solid wall at his back was the only thing holding him upright. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, was a raging storm. The touch of the baby's hand had not just sparked a memory, it had thrown open a locked door, releasing a ghost he had spent a lifetime trying to contain. He was no longer Dr. Alistair Wells, the esteemed chief of obstetrics. He was a terrified young resident again, 30 years in the past. The memory was no longer a fleeting flash, but a vivid, agonizing replay. He was in a different hospital, a smaller, poorly funded place on the other side of the country. It was the middle of the night during a long and grueling shift. He was exhausted, running on coffee and fear, left in charge of the neonatal ward for a precious few minutes while his senior went on a break. Then the alarm started. A piercing, frantic wail from an incubator in the corner. A tiny, premature baby girl was in distress. Her heart rate was plummeting. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. All the knowledge from his textbooks evaporated. He was alone. He needed to act. He remembered reaching into the incubator, his hands clumsy and shaking. He tried to perform a procedure, one he had only practiced on mannequins. He fumbled. His inexperience, his fear, created a fatal moment of hesitation. He made the wrong choice. He could still hear the terrible silence when the alarms finally stopped. The stillness in the air was heavier than any sound. The head nurse and his senior attending had returned to find him frozen, staring at the incubator, his face ashen. He had failed. A life was lost because of him. He confessed what happened, his voice trembling. But the attending, a world-weary man concerned with lawsuits and the hospital's fragile reputation, made a decision. It was a tragic, unforeseeable event, he had said, a complication no one could have predicted. The official report was written to reflect that story. The truth was buried, a shared, unspoken secret. Alistair, ashamed and terrified, had agreed. He ran from that hospital, from that city, from that version of himself, and never looked back. Until now. Elena's baby. The way his tiny fingers gripped his own was so full of trust, so full of life. It was a simple, innocent gesture that had judged him more profoundly than any hospital board ever could. It was the trust he had betrayed 30 years ago. As Alistair stumbled towards the refuge of his office, the world felt unsteady beneath his feet. He locked the door behind him and leaned over his sink, splashing cold water on his face. He looked up at the mirror, but it was not his own tired 60-year-old eyes that stared back. He saw the face of a scared 25-year-old boy drowning in guilt. The disruption was no longer just inside his head. The young nurse from the delivery room, deeply concerned by her superior's bizarre behavior, reported the incident to her charge nurse. She described how the doctor had recoiled from the baby, his face a mask of horror. The story was whispered at the nursing station, and Dr. Mark Roberts, who was just finishing his rounds, overheard every word. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. The untouchable Dr. Wells had finally shown a crack, and Roberts knew this was an opportunity he could not afford to miss. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing descent. Alistair's meticulously ordered world began to fray at the edges, the threads pulled loose by the ghost of his past. Sleep offered no escape. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that dimly lit neonatal ward. He would wake up abruptly, his heart racing, the phantom sound of alarms ringing in his ears. He started leaving the lights on in his silent, empty house, as if they could somehow ward off the shadows that now filled his mind. The man who thrived on control was losing it moment by moment. His work, once his only refuge, became a source of constant torment. The familiar rhythms of the hospital were now laced with triggers. The gentle beep of a fetal heart monitor sounded like a prelude to disaster. The cry of a newborn down the hall would make him flinch. He tried to maintain his authoritative facade, to conduct his rounds with the same sharp precision, but his focus was shattered. He would pause mid-sentence, his train of thought lost. He called a patient by the wrong name. He overlooked a detail in a chart that a junior resident had to point out. These were small slips, minor errors that caused no real harm, but for a man of Alistair's reputation, they were seismic events. The nurses and doctors who worked under him exchanged worried glances. The whispers grew from quiet murmurs to open speculation. Was Dr. Wells ill? Was the pressure finally getting to him? Dr. Roberts watched all of this with keen, predatory interest. He did not whisper. Instead, he started documenting Alistair's small failures, creating a quiet record of his superior's apparent decline. A strange, desperate compulsion took hold of Alistair. He found himself drawn back to Elena and her baby boy, who she had named Leo. He made excuses to visit the maternity ward far more often than was necessary. He would stand by the nursery window, watching Leo sleep in his bassinet. He would engage Eleanor in long conversations, asking about the baby's health, his feeding, his sleeping patterns. He told himself it was just professional diligence, but he knew it was something more. He needed to see this child thriving. He needed to see proof that life could flourish under his care. It was a desperate, irrational attempt to balance the scales of his past, to quiet the guilt that screamed in his soul. His unusual attention did not go unnoticed. "You seem to have taken a special interest in the Miller baby, Alistair," Roberts commented one afternoon, his tone a perfect mix of feigned curiosity and subtle accusation. "Is everything all right with the child?" Alistair felt a surge of defensive anger. "The child is perfectly healthy. I am simply being thorough," he replied, his voice colder than usual. But the encounter left him shaken. He was becoming transparent. His obsession was making him careless. When he was not at the hospital, he was at his computer, a man possessed. He spent hours each night trying to excavate the past. He searched for the name of the hospital where he had been a resident. It had been demolished years ago, replaced by a shopping center. He tried to recall the names of the nurses, of the senior doctor, who had helped him bury the truth. The names were lost to the fog of 30 years. He searched for any public record, any news article about an infant death around that time, but found nothing. It was as if it never happened, as if the little girl he failed had never existed. This digital void was almost worse than the memories themselves. It fed his growing fear that he was losing his mind, haunted by a tragedy that left no trace on the world. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the ghost of his mistake, and it was leading him deeper and deeper into the dark. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a routine procedure, one Alistair had performed hundreds, if not thousands of times, an amniocentesis. It required a steady hand and absolute focus. But as he guided the needle, his hand trembled. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. For a terrifying second, the image of a different needle in a different hand 30 years ago flashed in his mind. He hesitated. His focus broke. The patient felt a sharp, unexpected pain. The baby's heart rate on the monitor dipped alarmingly. Instantly, the room was a flurry of motion. Dr. Roberts, who had been observing from the corner of the room, stepped in. His voice was calm and decisive as he took over, stabilizing the situation. Within minutes, the crisis was averted. The mother was safe. The baby was safe. But Alistair's mistake hung in the air, undeniable and witnessed by everyone present. He stood frozen, the instrument still in his hand, the blood drained from his face. He had endangered a patient, the one thing he had sworn he would never do again. This was the opening Dr. Roberts had been waiting for. He filed a formal complaint with the hospital board, citing the incident as the culmination of weeks of erratic behavior and declining performance. He presented his meticulous notes, painting a picture of a chief of medicine who had become a liability. The board had no choice. An investigation was launched, and Dr. Alistair Wells was suspended, effective immediately. He was asked to hand over his pager and his hospital identification. He walked out of the hospital he had commanded for decades, not through the main entrance but through a side door, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He had not just lost his job, he had lost his identity. The days that followed were a silent, crushing void. His house, once a sanctuary of order, now felt like a tomb. There were no early morning rounds, no charts to review, no surgeries to command. There was only silence and the relentless looping replay of his failures. The recent mistake merged with the one from 30 years ago, becoming one single monstrous event in his mind. He was a fraud, a failure who had hidden behind a mask of competence. He sat in his chair for hours, staring at the blank television screen, convinced that he deserved this isolation, this public disgrace. He had finally hit rock bottom. The giant of medicine had fallen, and he had no desire to get back up. Then one afternoon, as he sat in the deepening twilight of his living room, the quiet chime of his computer broke the silence. An email. He ignored it at first, but the chime had broken the spell of his despair. He slowly walked to his desk and clicked it open. The sender's name was Elena Miller. His heart clenched. He expected a letter of complaint, a threat of a lawsuit. Instead, he saw a picture. It was baby Leo, swaddled in a blue blanket, looking at the camera with wide, curious eyes. He was perfect. He was thriving. Below the photo was a short message. "Dear Dr. Wells," it read, "we are home now and just wanted to send a proper thank you. We will never forget your kindness and the incredible care you gave us. You watched over Leo as if he were your own, and for that we will always be grateful. We hope you are doing well. Sincerely, Elena, Tom, and Leo." Alistair read the message once, then again, and again. A dry, painful sob escaped his lips. The world had branded him a failure, a danger. But this mother, the mother of the very child who had triggered his downfall, saw him as a protector. Her simple, heartfelt words did not erase his guilt or solve his problems, but they offered something he had not felt in 30 years, a tiny, fragile glimmer of grace. It was a flicker of light in his profound darkness. For the first time, he felt something other than shame. He felt a seed of purpose, not to reclaim his job or his reputation, but to somehow become the man Elena Miller believed him to be. It was the beginning of a different kind of journey. Elena's email was a lifeline, but it did not show Alistair the way to shore. It only stopped him from drowning. He sat with her words for a long time. The image of baby Leo's face burned into his mind. For 30 years, his strategy had been to build walls, to isolate himself with his secret. That strategy had led him here, to this moment of total ruin. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could not move forward alone. He needed to speak the truth out loud, to let the poison of his secret out into the open air. But who could he trust? The thought of talking to another doctor, especially one like Roberts, was impossible. He needed someone who understood the world of medicine, but who saw beyond the ego and the politics. He needed someone who saw the human heart behind the white coat. His mind settled on one person, Nurse Beatrice. Beatrice was a fixture in the obstetrics department, a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes and a calm that no hospital crisis could ever seem to shake. She had been there longer than Alistair had been chief. She had seen generations of doctors come and go. She was wise, discreet, and possessed a deep, quiet compassion. He remembered the day she had approached him in the hallway, asking if he was all right, her voice full of genuine concern. He had pushed her away then. Now, humbled and broken, he reached for his phone and found her number. They met in a small, quiet park far from the hospital. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the old oak trees. Alistair felt exposed and vulnerable, sitting on a simple wooden bench in his street clothes. For the first time in years, he was not Dr. Wells. He was just Alistair. Beatrice arrived and sat beside him, not speaking, simply waiting. Her patience gave him the courage to begin. And so he talked. The words came out in a torrent, a 30-year flood of guilt and fear. He told her everything. He spoke of the small hospital, the long shift, the blaring alarms. He described the baby girl he had failed, the terror of his mistake, and the crushing shame that followed. He confessed to the cover-up, to the life he had built as a way to run from that single defining moment. He told her about baby Leo and how the innocent touch of his hand had shattered his carefully constructed world. Throughout his confession, Beatrice just listened. She did not interrupt. She did not judge. She simply watched him, her gaze filled with a profound and gentle empathy. When he finally fell silent, his story told, tears shimmering in his eyes, she placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we all have ghosts. Medicine is a world filled with them. You made a terrible mistake when you were just a boy, scared and alone, and you have been punishing yourself for it every single day since." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The mistake was not the end of your story. Carrying it alone, that is the tragedy. You do not need to fight for your job right now. You need to fight for your peace. The first step is forgiving that young man you used to be." Her words were not a solution, but they were a compass. She did not offer him a map out of his troubles, but she offered him her presence on the journey. In that quiet park, under the patient gaze of a woman who saw not his failure but his pain, Alistair felt the first true shift within his soul. He was no longer entirely alone with his ghost. He had found an ally. The hospital boardroom was cold and imposing. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of the board members. At the head of the table sat the hospital director, a man whose expression was unreadable. Dr. Roberts was at one side, a neat stack of files in front of him, looking confident and poised for victory. At the other side sat Alistair. He was not looking at the files or the board members. His gaze was on Nurse Beatrice, who sat quietly in a chair against the back wall, a small, steady anchor in a turbulent sea. The director cleared his throat. "Dr. Roberts, you may begin." Roberts stood, the picture of calm professionalism. He laid out his case with ruthless precision. He spoke of Dr. Wells's long and distinguished career, but quickly pivoted to his recent troubling behavior. He detailed the missed chart notes, the distracted consultations, and the strange obsession with the Miller baby. His voice was steady, filled with feigned concern. Then he moved to the final, damning piece of evidence, the failed amniocentesis. He described the event in clinical detail, painting Alistair as a reckless, unstable physician who had become a clear and present danger to his patients. "It is with a heavy heart," Roberts concluded, "that I must recommend the permanent termination of Dr. Wells's privileges at this hospital for the safety of our patients." He sat down, a look of somber triumph on his face. The board members nodded gravely. The case seemed open and shut. "Dr. Wells," the director said, his voice flat, "do you have a response?" This was the moment. Everyone in the room expected a defense. They expected arguments, excuses, a desperate fight for a celebrated career. Alistair slowly rose to his feet. The room was silent. He looked at each member of the board, his gaze clear and steady. Everything Dr. Roberts has said about my recent conduct is true, Alistair began, his voice quiet but resonant. A ripple of shock went through the room. Roberts's confident smirk faltered. My hand did tremble. My focus did fail. I did put a patient at risk. There is no excuse for it. He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle. But my failure did not begin a few months ago. It did not begin with that procedure. My failure began 30 years ago when I was a young resident, terrified, and in over my head. The atmosphere in the room shifted. This was not a defense, this was a confession. With Beatrice's encouraging gaze upon him, Alistair told them everything. He held nothing back. He spoke of the understaffed hospital, the blaring alarms, and the little baby girl whose life had ended because of his panic. He described the crushing weight of his mistake and the shame that led him to accept the cover-up. For 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion but never breaking, I have tried to outrun that moment. I built a career, a reputation for perfection, all as a wall to hide behind. I became cold, distant, demanding. I thought if I could control everything, I could prevent it from ever happening again, but I was wrong. The guilt was always there. He then spoke of baby Leo. When that little boy grabbed my hand, it was as if he reached right through those walls and touched the secret I had buried. The foundation of my life cracked. Dr. Roberts is not wrong that I was unstable. I was a man haunted. He looked directly at Roberts, not with anger, but with a sad understanding. Then he turned back to the board. I am not here to ask for my job back. I am not here to save my reputation. I am here to finally tell the truth. I failed that little girl 30 years ago, and I am deeply, profoundly sorry. I accept whatever decision you make. He sat down. The boardroom was utterly silent. Roberts was pale, his victory turned to ash in his mouth. He had come prepared for a fight, not for a soul-bearing act of contrition. Alistair felt a sense of calm wash over him. The 30-year-old weight on his chest was finally gone. He had lost his career, but in that cold, sterile room, he had finally found his freedom. The silence that followed Alistair's confession was profound. The board members looked not at him, but at each other, their stern expressions replaced by something more complex. The hospital director announced a brief recess. As the board filed out, Dr. Roberts remained at the table, his posture rigid. His victory had dissolved into a humiliating public spectacle. He had intended to expose a hypocrite, but instead, he had revealed his own petty ambition in the face of a man's profound atonement. Nurse Beatrice walked over to Alistair and simply placed a hand on his shoulder. It was all the support he needed. When the board returned, the director's tone had changed. It was no longer flat and cold, but measured and thoughtful. Dr. Wells, he began, the board acknowledges the severity of the historical event you have described, as well as the recent incident. However, we are also struck by your complete honesty and by a career that has, for 30 years, been nothing short of exemplary. He continued, we will not be terminating your privileges. A quiet gasp came from Roberts. Your suspension will be upheld for 6 months, during which time we require that you attend counseling. Upon your return, you will not resume your duties as Chief of Obstetrics. Alistair nodded, expecting this. Instead, the director said, we would like to offer you a new role, a position as a senior mentor and instructor for our residents. We believe your experience, all of it, could be an invaluable lesson in medical ethics and the human pressures of this profession. It was not a punishment. It was a path forward, a way to turn his greatest failure into a source of wisdom. Dr. Roberts was granted the chief position he had so desperately wanted, but it was a hollow crown. The respect he craved from his colleagues had curdled into quiet disapproval. He had the title, but he had lost the trust of the people he was meant to lead. His victory felt in every meaningful way like a defeat. Alistair's journey, however, was not over. The board's decision had resolved his career, but not his soul. With Beatrice's quiet encouragement, he knew there was one more step he had to take. During his suspension, he dedicated himself to finding the mother of the baby girl he had lost. With a clear mind and a singular purpose, he finally succeeded. Her name was Sarah. She lived a quiet life in a small town a few states away. He wrote her a letter, asking if she would be willing to meet him, explaining only that he was a doctor from her past and needed to speak with her. She agreed. They met in a small, quiet cafe. Alistair's heart pounded as he watched her walk in, a woman with kind eyes and hair streaked with grey. He expected to see anger in her face, but there was only a tired curiosity. With a trembling voice, he told her the truth. He told her who he was, what had happened that night, and how his fear and inexperience had led to the loss of her daughter. He apologized, tears streaming down his face, for his mistake and for the silence he had allowed to follow. Sarah listened without interruption. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. "I always knew," she said softly. "I always felt that the report was not the whole story. I was so young. I did not know how to fight it." Tears welled in her own eyes. "I am not angry at you," she said, her voice heavy with the grief of decades. "I am sad. I am sad for my daughter. And I'm sad for you, for carrying this all by yourself for so long." In that small cafe, two strangers bound by a 30-year-old tragedy did not find absolution. But they found something just as powerful. They found a shared truth. And in that truth, there was finally a chance for peace. 2 years later, the formidable Dr. Wells was gone. In his place was Alistair. The hospital halls he walked were the same, but he moved through them differently. The air of intimidating authority had been replaced by a quiet, approachable warmth. He spent his days not in boardrooms or operating theatres, but in classrooms and lounges, surrounded by the next generation of doctors. He taught them about medicine, but more importantly, he taught them about humanity. He spoke of the immense pressure they would face, of the inevitability of mistakes, and of the profound importance of honesty and self-forgiveness. He was the best teacher they had, not just because of his vast knowledge, but because of the wisdom in his eyes, a wisdom born from a deep and personal pain. His home had changed too. The cold, minimalist shell had been transformed into a place of comfort. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating shelves that now held novels alongside medical texts. On a small table by his favorite armchair sat a framed photograph. It was of a smiling 1-year-old Leo, sent by Elena on his first birthday. His friendship with Beatrice had blossomed. They met for coffee every week, their conversations easy and filled with laughter. She had been his anchor in the storm, and now she was his cherished friend in the calm. One bright Saturday afternoon, Alistair sat on the same park bench where he had once confessed his deepest secret to Beatrice. He was not alone. A small boy, now a toddler with a head of messy brown hair, ran across the grass toward him on unsteady legs. "Ali!" the boy shouted with glee. Alistair's face broke into a genuine, radiant smile. He knelt down and opened his arms, and Leo crashed into him for a hug. Elena watched from a short distance away, her expression full of affection. She and Alistair had become good friends. She never knew the full story of his past, but she knew he was a kind, decent man who cared deeply for her son. Leo pulled back and held up his hand. Alistair took it without a second of hesitation. The small fingers curled around his, just as they had done 2 years ago in that delivery room. But this time, there was no jolt of pain. There was no horrifying flash of the past. There was only the simple, perfect warmth of a child's trust. There was only peace. Alistair looked at the boy, then up at the clear blue sky, a feeling of profound gratitude washing over him. The touch that he once believed had exposed him, the touch that had shattered his life, had in fact been his salvation. It had forced him down into the darkness of his own past, so that he could finally emerge into the light, a new man, whole and free. What an incredible journey of redemption and healing. The story of Dr. Alistair Wells reminds us that sometimes our lives must fall apart so they can be rebuilt into something stronger and more authentic. It shows us that the secrets we carry can be heavy burdens, but the truth, while painful, can set us free. It is a powerful lesson in forgiveness, not only from others, but most importantly, from ourselves. We all have moments in our past we are not proud of. We all have made mistakes. This story touches on something universal, the human need for a second chance. It speaks to the courage it takes to face our own ghosts and the incredible power of compassion from an ally, like Nurse Beatrice, who offers a hand when we are lost in the dark. And now, we want to hear from you. The stories we share here come alive in the community we build together. What did you feel while listening to Alistair's story? Did his confession in that boardroom move you? Have you ever had a moment in your life that you thought was the end, only for it to become a new beginning? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story could be the glimmer of hope that someone else needs to read today. Who has been the Nurse Beatrice in your life, a person who listened without judgment and guided you with kindness? Let us take a moment to celebrate those incredible people. If this story of hope and redemption touched your heart, please show your support by giving this video a like. Liking the video helps our channel grow and allows these stories to reach more people who may be looking for a message of inspiration and healing. And if you are new to our channel, The Legacy Chronicles, and you want to fill your days with more powerful and emotional stories like this one, then please consider subscribing. We are dedicated to bringing you narratives that explore the depths of the human heart and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Make sure you also click the notification bell after you subscribe. That way, you will be the first to know whenever we release a new story, and you will not miss a single moment of the journeys we share. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Remember that every life has a story, and every story has a lesson. Be kind to yourself, forgive your past, and look toward the future with an open heart. We cannot wait to see you in our next story.